Some acts of kindness ripple through our lives in ways we never see coming. Sometimes a single moment of decency between strangers can change the course of two hearts forever. In Cedar Ridge, Cowboy Jasper Hartwell lived alone and liked it that way. When he spotted a young schoolteacher caught in a thunderstorm, he offered his hat and walked her home. Nothing more than good manners, he figured. 3 days later, Victoria Summers knocked on his cabin door with a proposition that would shake his quiet world. She needed help building a new schoolhouse. But what she was really asking for was something much bigger. She was asking a man who'd given up on dreams to believe in second chances. Could a weathered cowboy and a determined teacher build more than just a school together? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rolling hills outside Cedar Ridge as Jasper Hartwell guided his horse Thunder along the familiar path toward the grazing pastures. At 42, Jasper had the weathered hands and sun-lined face of a man who'd spent his entire adult life working the land. His silver pocket watch, his father's watch, caught the early light as he checked the time. 7:30. Same as every morning for the past 15 years. Jasper's cabin sat on a gentle rise about 2 miles from town, close enough to hear the church bell on Sundays, but far enough to maintain the solitude he'd grown to treasure. The small log structure was neat and functional, built with his own hands shortly after Sarah died. Everything inside had a place and purpose. The single plate and cup on the kitchen shelf, the worn leather chair by the stone fireplace, the narrow bed that had never felt too small for one. Thunder nickered softly as they approached the cattle, and Jasper patted the bay's neck with genuine affection. The horse had been his constant companion for 8 years now, understanding Jasper's moods and needs with an intuition that sometimes unsettled him. Animals were easier than people, he'd learned. They didn't ask questions you couldn't answer or expect more than you could give. The memory of Sarah still lived in the careful way he folded his shirts, in the wildflower seeds he planted each spring around the cabin's foundation, in the silver watch he carried but rarely looked at. She'd given it to him on their wedding day, her father's gift passed down through her family. "So you'll always have time for me," she'd whispered, her eyes bright with the future they'd planned together. That future had lasted exactly 13 months. Sarah had been 23 when the fever took her and their unborn child. Jasper had been 27, young enough to believe that love conquered everything and old enough to know better when it didn't. The guilt had settled into his bones like winter cold. The certainty that somehow he should have done more, should have seen the signs earlier, should have been able to save them both. Cedar Ridge had grown considerably in the years since, transforming from a rough cattle town into something approaching civilization. The railroad had arrived 5 years back, bringing Eastern goods and Eastern ideas in equal measure. Main Street now boasted a proper general store run by Henry Morrison, a bank managed by the serious-minded Mr. Franklin, and 3 saloons that served cowboys, railroad workers, and the occasional traveling businessman with varying degrees of respectability. The townspeople had long since stopped trying to draw Jasper into their social circles. He attended church on Christmas and Easter, paid his bills on time, and helped when emergencies required an extra pair of hands. But he kept his own counsel and his own company, and most folks had learned to respect that choice, which was why the arrival of Miss Victoria Summers had caused such a stir. She'd stepped off the eastbound train 3 weeks ago, wearing a traveling dress of deep blue wool and carrying a leather satchel that looked like it had seen considerable use. Word spread quickly through town that the new schoolteacher was younger than expected, maybe 25 or 26, with auburn hair, pinned in a practical style and green eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. The previous teacher, elderly Mr. Pemberton, had retired to live with his daughter in Kansas City, leaving Cedar Ridge's children with sporadic lessons taught by whoever volunteered that week. The school board, such as it was, had advertised back east for a replacement and received exactly one response: Miss Victoria Summers of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, holder of a teaching certificate from the Philadelphia Normal School and 3 years' experience in city classrooms. From his weekly trips to Morrison's store for supplies, Jasper had overheard enough conversations to piece together the town's mixed feelings about their new teacher. The women seemed cautiously optimistic. A real teacher with real credentials was nothing to dismiss lightly. The men ranged from skeptical to concerned, wondering what kind of Eastern ideas she might bring and whether a young unmarried woman could maintain proper authority over their children. Jasper had seen her exactly twice before the storm. The first time, she'd been standing outside the current schoolhouse, a converted storage room behind the general store, examining the building with the focused attention of someone mentally cataloging problems. The second time, she'd been at Morrison's store, ordering supplies and asking Henry about local families with school-age children. Her voice carried the crisp diction of formal education, but she'd listened carefully to Henry's rambling answers and asked thoughtful follow-up questions. She'd noticed Jasper both times, offering a polite nod that he'd returned with his hat brim touched in acknowledgement. Nothing more than the courtesy any decent man would show a lady. But something about her direct gaze had lingered in his memory longer than it should have. The cattle were spread across the south pasture, grazing contentedly in the morning cool. Jasper dismounted and began his daily inspection, checking for injuries, signs of illness, or fence damage that might let the animals wander. It was methodical work that left his mind free to wander, and lately his thoughts had drifted more often toward town and the changes happening there. Cedar Ridge was growing, that much was undeniable. New families arrived monthly, drawn by railroad jobs, farming opportunities, and the promise of Western freedom. With growth came the need for institutions, better schools, proper churches, maybe even a library someday. Jasper understood the logic, even admired the ambition, but change had never sat comfortably with him. Change meant hope for the future, and hope had proven a dangerous companion. Thunder raised his head suddenly, ears pricked toward the distant sound of the school bell ringing across the morning air. 9 o'clock, time for lessons to begin in the cramped room behind Morrison's store. Jasper could picture Miss Victoria Summers calling her students to order, her crisp voice cutting through the chatter of children who'd rather be anywhere else on such a fine September morning. He pulled his father's watch from his pocket and confirmed the time, running his thumb over the worn silver case as he'd done thousands of times before. The inscription inside, engraved in Sarah's careful handwriting, had long since been memorized. "All my time is yours. My love." She'd had the jeweler add those words as a surprise, presenting the watch to him with shy pride on their wedding morning. Jasper snapped the watch closed and returned it to his pocket, turning his attention back to the cattle. The past was past, and dwelling on what couldn't be changed served no purpose. He had work to do, responsibilities to meet, and a life that functioned perfectly well without complications. As the morning wore on, clouds began gathering on the western horizon, dark and heavy with the promise of rain. By noon, the wind had picked up enough to make the cattle restless, and Jasper decided to drive them closer to the shelter of the creek bottom before the storm arrived. Thunder seemed to sense his urgency, responding to subtle shifts in weight and direction as they worked the small herd toward safety. The first drops of rain began falling just as they secured the last of the fence rails. Within minutes, the scattered drops had become a steady downpour, and Jasper pulled his hat low over his eyes as he mounted Thunder for the ride back toward town. The horse picked his way carefully along the muddy trail, both rider and mount eager for the dry warmth of the stable. It was then, as they approached the outskirts of Cedar Ridge, that Jasper saw her. Miss Victoria Summers stood outside the schoolhouse, her dark blue dress already soaked through, holding what appeared to be a lesson book over her head in a futile attempt to stay dry. The children had clearly been dismissed when the storm struck, leaving her alone to gather scattered papers and supplies from where the wind had blown them across the schoolyard. Jasper's first instinct was to ride past, Getting involved in other people's problems had never been his way, and a soaked schoolteacher was hardly his responsibility. But something about her determined struggle against the elements, the way she refused to abandon her materials despite the worsening weather, made him pull Thunder to a stop. "Miss Summers," he called over the drumming rain, "you'll catch your death standing out here." She looked up, rainwater streaming from her hair despite the book she held overhead. "Mr. Hartwell, isn't it?" Her voice carried clearly, even through the storm. "I'm afraid the wind scattered my lesson plans. I can't leave them to be ruined." Without further debate, Jasper swung down from Thunder and removed his wide-brimmed hat. "Here," he said, placing it over her head. "This will serve you better than that book." The hat was large enough to provide real shelter, and Victoria looked up at him with surprise and gratitude. "Thank you, but now you'll be soaked." "I'm already wet," Jasper replied, gathering the scattered papers with practiced efficiency. "Where were you headed?" "Mrs. Patterson's boarding house on Elm Street." Victoria clutched the rescued papers to her chest. "I rent a room there." Jasper nodded toward Thunder. "Horse can carry us both that far. Faster than walking in this weather." For a moment Victoria hesitated, and Jasper recognized the calculation in her expression, a single woman's careful consideration of propriety versus practical necessity. The rain made the decision for her as a fresh downpour soaked through even his protective hat. "I'd be grateful for the help," she said. Jasper helped her mount before swinging up behind her, careful to maintain respectful distance while ensuring she wouldn't fall. Thunder moved forward with his characteristic steady gait, untroubled by the double burden or the continuing storm. The ride to Mrs. Patterson's took less than 10 minutes, but it was long enough for Jasper to notice the subtle scent of lavender in Victoria's hair, the determined set of her shoulders as she protected her teaching materials, and the way she sat the horse with surprising comfort for someone from the city. "You've ridden before," he observed. "My grandfather had a farm outside Philadelphia," Victoria replied. "I spent summers there as a child." She paused. "I didn't expect to miss it as much as I do." There was something wistful in her tone that made Jasper glance down at her, but her face was turned toward the boarding house that had appeared through the rain. He helped her dismount at the front steps, retrieving his hat as she hurried toward the shelter of the covered porch. "Thank you, Mr. Hartwell," she called back to him. "I'm truly grateful for your kindness." Jasper touched his hat brim in acknowledgement, water streaming from his hair as he rode away toward the livery stable. It had been nothing more than common decency, the same help he'd offer anyone caught in such weather. But as Thunder carried him through the rain toward dry shelter, Jasper found himself thinking about the determined light in Victoria Summers' green eyes, and the way she'd protected those lesson plans as if they contained something precious. 3 days later, he was still thinking about it when the knock came at his cabin door. The knock came just as Jasper was settling into his evening routine, the sound echoing through his cabin like an unexpected gunshot. He paused with his coffee cup halfway to his lips, listening to the autumn wind that had been building all afternoon. No one visited his cabin, especially not after dark on a Tuesday in late September. The second knock was more insistent, accompanied by a voice he recognized immediately. "Mr. Hartwell? It's Victoria Summers. I apologize for the late hour, but I need to speak with you." Jasper set down his coffee and moved to the door, his mind racing through possible emergencies that might bring the schoolteacher to his remote cabin. When he opened the door, Victoria stood in the circle of lamplight, her dark cloak wrapped tightly against the wind. She carried a leather portfolio under one arm and wore an expression of determined resolve that reminded him of a cavalry officer preparing for battle. "Miss Summers," he said, stepping aside automatically. "Come in out of the wind." Victoria entered his cabin with quick, purposeful steps, her gaze taking in the neat, sparse interior with the efficiency he'd noticed during their brief acquaintance. She remained standing near the door, clutching her portfolio like a shield. "I'm sorry to intrude," she began, her voice carrying the formal tone she used with difficult parents. "But I have a proposition that I believe will benefit both of us, and more importantly, the children of this community." Jasper gestured toward his single chair by the fireplace. "Sit down. I'll put on more coffee. Thank you, but I'd rather stand." Victoria opened her portfolio and withdrew a bundle of papers covered in neat handwriting and precise drawings. "I want to hire you to build a schoolhouse." The directness of her statement caught Jasper off guard. He'd expected a request for help with a broken door or perhaps assistance moving furniture. Instead, she stood in his cabin, proposing a project that would take months and cost more money than most folks in Cedar Ridge saw in a year. "Miss Summers," he said carefully, "I think you might be confusing me with someone else. I'm a cattleman, not a carpenter." Victoria's green eyes flashed with something that might have been impatience. "Mr. Morrison tells me you built this entire cabin yourself. He also mentioned that you helped construct the new church steeple last spring and repaired the schoolhouse roof after the hailstorm in July." Jasper felt a familiar irritation at Henry Morrison's loose tongue. The man collected and distributed information like a trading post dealt in goods, never considering that some folks preferred their business to remain private. "That was just neighborly help," Jasper said. "Nothing like what you're talking about." Victoria spread the papers across his small kitchen table, revealing detailed architectural drawings that showed considerable skill and planning. "This is what I'm talking about. A proper schoolhouse with real windows, adequate lighting, and space for 30 students. A building designed specifically for education, not converted from whatever space happens to be available." Despite himself, Jasper found his attention drawn to the drawings. The proposed building was ambitious but practical, with high ceilings for better air circulation, large windows positioned to maximize natural light, and a layout that would allow one teacher to effectively manage multiple grade levels. "These are fine plans," he admitted, "but they'd require materials, skilled labor, and more money than the school board could raise in 5 years. Victoria's chin lifted with stubborn pride. "The Merchants Association has already pledged half the lumber. Mr. Franklin at the bank believes he can arrange favorable credit terms for the remainder. Mrs. Patterson has organized the women to provide meals for workers, and several fathers have volunteered their time. And what about the land? Mr. Morrison is donating 2 acres on the north edge of town. Good high ground with access to the road, but far enough from the saloons to maintain proper atmosphere." Jasper studied the drawings more carefully, recognizing the thoroughness of Victoria's planning. She'd anticipated every objection and prepared practical solutions. The project was ambitious but not impossible, assuming someone with the necessary skills could be convinced to take it on. "Why me?" he asked. "There are men in town who know construction work better than I do." Victoria's composed expression softened slightly, revealing something vulnerable beneath her professional determination. "Because I watched you work on the church steeple. You didn't just nail boards together. You crafted something that would last. You took pride in the details, even when no one was looking." The observation surprised Jasper with its accuracy. He did take pride in his work, had learned from his father that anything worth doing deserved your best effort, regardless of who noticed. "Besides," Victoria continued, "the other men all have families and businesses that demand their time. You have the freedom to dedicate yourself fully to the project." There was no judgment in her words, but Jasper felt the familiar sting of his isolation. His freedom was really just another name for the emptiness that had shaped his life for 15 years. "I appreciate the confidence," he said, "but I'm not interested in taking on such a large commitment." Victoria gathered her papers with brisk efficiency, but her disappointment was clearly visible. "May I ask why? Is it the payment? Because I can arrange—" "It's not about money." Jasper moved to the fireplace, staring into the flames rather than meeting her direct gaze. "I'm not the right man for this kind of project." "What kind of project?" "The kind that brings hope to people. The kind that builds futures." He turned to face her, his voice carrying 15 years of accumulated caution. "I don't build things for other people anymore, Miss Summers. I learned that lesson the hard way." Victoria studied him with the same careful attention she'd shown his cabin. as if she could read his history in the lines around his eyes and the set of his shoulders. "This isn't about building something for other people," she said quietly. "It's about building something with them. There's a difference. Not enough of one." Victoria closed her portfolio, but made no move toward the door. "Mr. Hartwell, I came here tonight because I need help. Not just with construction. I need someone who understands what it means to create something lasting in a place that's changing so quickly. People hardly recognize it from year to year." Her words carried unexpected weight, touching on something Jasper had felt but never articulated. Cedar Ridge was changing, had been changing since the railroad arrived, and most of the changes felt like losses to him. The quiet rhythms of cattle country giving way to the bustle of commerce and progress. "I've been teaching for 3 weeks in a converted storage room," Victoria continued. "The children deserve better. They deserve a place built specifically for learning, somewhere they can imagine their futures expanding beyond whatever their parents managed to accomplish. And you think a new building will accomplish that?" "I think it's a start," Victoria's voice carried quiet conviction. "I think when children walk into a space designed for their education, when they see that adults cared enough to build something beautiful and permanent for their benefit, it changes how they see themselves and their possibilities." Jasper found himself thinking about his own childhood, the one-room schoolhouse where he'd learned basic reading and arithmetic before his father decided the boy was needed more on the ranch than in the classroom. He'd always wondered what might have been different if he'd had more formal education, more exposure to books and ideas beyond the practical knowledge of cattle and weather. "Even if I agreed," he said, "it would take months to complete. We're already into fall. We could begin with the foundation work and framing. The heaviest construction could be finished before winter sets in too hard." Victoria opened her portfolio again, withdrawing a single sheet covered with precise calculations. "I've researched the weather patterns for this area. We have approximately 6 weeks before the first hard freeze, possibly 8 if we're fortunate. Enough time to get the structure enclosed and weatherproofed." Her thoroughness impressed him, despite his reservations. She'd approached the project with the systematic planning of someone accustomed to solving complex problems, but also with the passion of someone who truly believed in what she was trying to accomplish. "Miss Summers," Jasper said carefully, "I appreciate what you're trying to do. Education is important, and the children do deserve better facilities. But I'm not the man to help you build dreams." Victoria's expression grew thoughtful, as if she were considering a particularly difficult arithmetic problem. "Mr. Hartwell, when you helped me during the storm 3 days ago, what were you thinking?" The unexpected question caught Jasper off guard. "I wasn't thinking anything particular. You needed help." "Exactly. You saw someone who needed assistance, and you provided it without calculating the cost or considering whether it was your responsibility." Victoria stepped closer, her green eyes intense with conviction. "That's exactly the kind of thinking this project needs." That was different. That was just common decency, was it? "Because I've been in Cedar Ridge for 3 weeks, and I've observed how people interact with each other. Most folks are decent enough, but they help within certain boundaries. Family first, then close friends, then neighbors if it's convenient." Victoria paused. "You helped a stranger in a storm because it was the right thing to do. That's not common decency, Mr. Hartwell. That's character." Jasper felt uncomfortable under her direct praise, the way he always did when people attributed noble motives to simple actions. "You don't know me well enough to make such judgments." "Perhaps not. But I know you built this cabin to last generations, even though you live alone. I know you repaired the church steeple without being asked and refused payment. I know you've maintained the cemetery fence for years without anyone requesting it." Victoria's voice grew softer. "Those aren't the actions of a man who's given up on building things for other people." The accuracy of her observations unsettled Jasper more than he wanted to admit. Somehow in 3 weeks, this Eastern schoolteacher had noticed details about his life that most longtime residents of Cedar Ridge took for granted. "Maybe I just don't like seeing things fall apart," he said. Victoria smiled for the first time since entering his cabin. transforming her earnest face with unexpected warmth. Then help me build something that won't fall apart. Help me create something this community can be proud of for decades to come. The wind rattled the cabin windows, emphasizing the lateness of the hour and the strangeness of the situation. An unmarried woman in a bachelor's cabin, discussing a project that would bind them together for months of daily collaboration. Any number of tongues would wag if the arrangement became known, yet Victoria seemed unconcerned with such considerations. People will talk, Jasper said. People always talk. The question is whether we're going to let their opinions prevent us from doing something worthwhile. Victoria gathered her papers one final time, but her movements were slower now, less decisive. I won't pretend this will be easy, Mr. Hartwell. The construction will be challenging, the weather will be unpredictable, and there will certainly be people who oppose the project for various reasons. But I have to believe, that some things are worth the difficulty. She moved toward the door, then paused with her hand on the latch. I'll give you 3 days to consider my proposal. If you decide against it, I'll respect your decision and find another way. But I hope you'll think about what we could accomplish together. Victoria opened the door, and the wind immediately caught her cloak, billowing it around her like dark wings. Good evening, Mr. Hartwell. Thank you for listening. After she left, Jasper stood at his window, watching her figure disappear into the darkness, heading back toward town on foot, despite the late hour and difficult weather. Her determination was remarkable, even foolhardy, but there was something admirable about her refusal to be deterred by obstacles that would discourage most people. He returned to the kitchen table, where her drawings remained spread like a promise of things that might be possible. The schoolhouse she envisioned was beautiful in its simplicity, designed with both practical necessity and aesthetic grace. It would be a landmark building, something that would define Cedar Ridge for generations. Jasper poured himself another cup of coffee and settled into his chair by the fire. But his attention kept drifting back to those precise drawings. Despite his protests, despite his careful cultivation of solitude, something about Victoria Summers' proposition called to a part of himself he'd thought permanently buried with Sarah. Maybe it was time to find out if he remembered how to build something for the future, instead of just maintaining remnants from the past. Jasper spent the next 2 days trying to convince himself that building Victoria's schoolhouse was a mistake he couldn't afford to make. He threw himself into ranch work with unusual intensity, mending fence that didn't need mending and reorganizing his barn with the methodical precision of a man avoiding important decisions. But Victoria's drawings haunted him. During quiet moments, feeding Thunder, checking the cattle, sitting alone by his evening fire, he found himself visualizing the construction process, mentally calculating board feet and foundation requirements with the expertise his father had drilled into him decades earlier. His father's carpentry tools still occupied the corner of his barn, where he'd placed them after the old man's death 12 years ago. The wooden toolbox bore the scratches and stains of 40 years' honest labor, each implement worn smooth by hands that had built half the original structures in Cedar Ridge. Jasper had maintained them carefully, oiling the metal and replacing handles when necessary. But they'd seen little use since Sarah's death. On the morning of the 3rd day, Victoria appeared at his cabin door again, this time carrying a basket that smelled of fresh bread and coffee. She wore a practical brown dress and sturdy walking boots, her hair pinned back in a style that suggested she'd come prepared for more than conversation. "Good morning, Mr. Hartwell," she said with brisk cheerfulness. "I brought breakfast and a proposition." Jasper accepted the offered coffee with the wariness of a man who'd learned to be suspicious of determined women bearing gifts. "Miss Summers, if this is about the schoolhouse, it's about the land," Victoria interrupted, settling herself on his porch steps without invitation. "I thought you might like to see the site before making your final decision." The suggestion was reasonable enough that Jasper couldn't refuse without seeming deliberately obstinate. After sharing Victoria's excellent breakfast, cornbread, bacon and coffee that put his own bitter brew to shame, he saddled Thunder while she waited with the patient composure of someone accustomed to getting her way through gentle persistence. The ride to the proposed school site took them through the heart of Cedar Ridge, past the general store where Henry Morrison waved from his front porch, beyond the bank where Mr. Franklin tipped his hat with formal courtesy, and around the church where several women were hanging laundry behind the parsonage. Jasper noticed how many people called out greetings to Victoria, how easily she'd integrated herself into the community's daily rhythm. "You've made friends quickly," he observed. Victoria adjusted her position behind him on Thunder's back, her voice carrying over the steady clip of hooves on packed earth. "Teaching children is the fastest way to become part of any community. Their parents have no choice but to get to know you." The donated land sat on a gentle rise north of town, overlooking the main road, but separated from commercial traffic by a grove of cottonwood trees that would provide natural windbreak and shade. Morrison had chosen well. The site offered good drainage, convenient access, and enough elevation to command respect while remaining approachable. Jasper dismounted and helped Victoria down, then stood surveying the property with the critical eye of someone who understood how landscape influenced construction. The ground was solid, with bedrock close enough to the surface to provide stable foundation support, but not so shallow as to make excavation difficult. "What do you think?" Victoria asked, her tone carefully neutral. Jasper walked the perimeter slowly, examining soil conditions and natural drainage patterns. The site would work well for her proposed design, offering practical advantages that would make construction easier and the finished building more durable. "It's good land for building," he admitted. "Morrison knows his business." Victoria opened her ever-present portfolio and spread the architectural drawings on a flat boulder that would serve as an impromptu desk. "I've been refining the plans based on suggestions from some of the parents. Mrs. Henderson thinks we should include a small library alcove, and Mr. Franklin believes we need better storage for winter coal." The revised drawings showed thoughtful incorporation of community input while maintaining the elegant simplicity of her original vision. Jasper found himself studying the structural details with professional interest, noting load-bearing considerations and joint specifications that revealed surprising technical knowledge. "Where did you learn about building construction?" he asked. "My grandfather was a master carpenter before he became a farmer," Victoria replied. "I spent enough summers helping him to understand basic principles, even if I lack the skill to execute them properly." She pointed to specific elements in the drawings, the foundation design, the roof pitch, the window placement, explaining her, reasoning with technical vocabulary that impressed Jasper despite his reservations about the project. "The windows face south and east to maximize natural light during school hours," she said. "The entry is positioned to minimize drafts, but allow proper supervision of the schoolyard. The ceiling height provides good air circulation, which is essential when you have 30 children in one room." Jasper examined the structural specifications more closely, recognizing sound engineering principles adapted for local climate and available materials. "These plans show real understanding of Western building requirements. I've been researching frontier architecture since I arrived," Victoria said. "The territorial library in the county seat has excellent technical resources, and I've consulted with builders in 3 neighboring towns." Her thoroughness continued to surprise him. Most people approach construction projects with enthusiasm, but little practical knowledge, assuming that good intentions could substitute for technical expertise. Victoria had combined her educational background with systematic research, creating plans that were both ambitious and realistic. "The foundation work would need to begin immediately," Jasper said, studying the site conditions. "Ground freeze comes early some years." Victoria's eyes brightened with hope, but she kept her voice carefully controlled. "Does that mean you're considering the project?" Jasper folded the drawings and handed them back to her, avoiding direct answer. "It means that if someone were to build this schoolhouse, they'd need to start within the week." They remounted Thunder and rode back toward town in companionable silence, both lost in private calculations. Jasper found himself visualizing the construction process, identifying potential challenges and planning solutions with the automatic expertise that came from decades of building experience. Victoria seemed content to let him think, understanding that some decisions couldn't be rushed. As they approached the outskirts of Cedar Ridge, they encountered a small group of children walking home from their morning lessons. The youngest, a girl of perhaps 6 with braided brown hair, waved enthusiastically at Victoria. "Miss Summers, did you see the snakeskin Tommy found behind the store?" Victoria reined Thunder to a stop, giving the child her full attention despite the pressing business of the morning. "I did see it, Emma. What did you think about its pattern?" "It looked like letters." Emma's excitement was infectious. "Like someone tried to write words on snakeskin." "That's very observant," Victoria said seriously. "Patterns in nature often remind us of human symbols. Perhaps we could study more examples tomorrow." The brief exchange revealed something about Victoria's teaching philosophy that the sterile confines of the converted storage room had concealed. She treated children's observations with genuine respect, turning casual discoveries into learning opportunities without condescension or impatience. After the children continued on their way, Victoria guided Thunder toward the livery stable, where they'd arranged to leave the horse. "Those children deserve better than a cramped room that smells of old grain sacks," she said quietly. Jasper helped her dismount, noting how naturally she handled herself around horses despite her city background. Education happened in cramped rooms for generations. Didn't seem to hurt anyone, didn't it? Victoria's green eyes held his steadily. How do we know what potential was lost because bright children couldn't imagine themselves as scholars? How many future doctors or teachers or engineers gave up their dreams because their first classroom told them learning wasn't worth investing in? The question touched something Jasper had wondered about his own truncated education. Would he have become something different if his schoolhouse had been more than a drafty shack with broken windows and outdated books? "Maybe you're right," he said. "Maybe the setting matters more than I thought." Victoria secured her portfolio carefully, protecting the precious drawings from dust and wind. "Mr. Hartwell, I know this is a significant commitment for you. I'm not asking lightly, and I won't think less of you if you decide against it." Her honesty deserved equal directness in return. "Miss Summers, I haven't built anything substantial since my wife died 15 years ago." "I'm not sure I remember how." "But you maintained this town's buildings for 15 years, Victoria replied. "You kept things standing when they wanted to fall down. That takes the same skills, just applied differently." Jasper considered her words as he unsaddled Thunder and brushed the horse down with familiar, methodical strokes. Maintenance was about preventing decay, preserving what already existed. Construction was about creating something new, building toward an imagined future. The difference felt enormous, but perhaps Victoria was right about the underlying similarities. "I'll need to examine your plans more carefully," he said finally. "Check the structural calculations, research material costs, determine realistic timelines." Victoria's smile was radiant with barely contained hope. "Does that mean—" "It means I'll look at the plans," Jasper interrupted, unwilling to commit further until he'd thoroughly considered all implications. No promises beyond that. But as Victoria walked back toward town, her step lighter with renewed optimism, Jasper found himself already planning the project's first phase. Foundation work would require careful site preparation, precise measurements, and materials that would need to be ordered immediately if construction was to begin before winter weather complicated everything. That evening, he retrieved his father's toolbox from the barn corner where it had waited patiently through 15 years of disuse. The familiar weight of hammer and square, the clean scent of oiled wood and sharpened steel, brought back memories of working alongside the old man during Cedar Ridge's early construction boom. "A building's only as good as its foundation," his father had always said. "Get that right, and everything else follows naturally." Perhaps it was time to test whether that wisdom applied to more than just carpentry. The decision came to Jasper not as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual surrender to inevitability. like watching storm clouds gather on a clear morning. He spent 3 more days studying Victoria's architectural drawings, checking her calculations against his father's engineering principles, and estimating costs with the methodical precision that had made him successful in the cattle business. Every analysis reached the same conclusion. The project was ambitious but achievable, expensive but worth the investment, challenging but not impossible. More troubling was his growing realization that he wanted to build Victoria's schoolhouse, wanted it with an intensity that surprised him after 15 years of careful emotional numbness. On Saturday morning, he loaded his father's tools into the wagon bed and drove to town. Victoria was teaching weekend lessons to children whose parents worked during regular school hours, her voice carrying through the open windows of the cramped storage room as she guided them through basic arithmetic. Jasper waited on the general store's front porch, listening to her patient explanations and the children's eager responses, until Henry Morrison emerged with his characteristic curiosity about any unusual activity in Cedar Ridge. "Morning, Jasper," Henry said, eyeing the wagon load of carpentry tools with obvious interest. "Looks like you're planning some serious building." "Maybe," Jasper replied non-committally, knowing that any information shared with Henry would circulate through town faster than wildfire through dry grass. When Victoria dismissed her weekend students, she emerged from the storage room with ink-stained fingers and the weary satisfaction of someone who'd accomplished meaningful work under difficult conditions. Her face brightened when she saw Jasper waiting with his loaded wagon. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, approaching with carefully controlled hope. "This is an unexpected pleasure." Jasper gestured toward his tools. "Thought we might take another look at that building site. If you're still interested in the project." Victoria's professional composure cracked slightly, revealing genuine emotion beneath her teacher's mask. "Does this mean—" "It means we should probably start with foundation work before the weather turns," Jasper said. "Assuming you're still determined to see this through." Victoria's smile was answer enough. Within an hour, they'd driven to the donated land north of town, where Jasper began the methodical process of translating architectural drawings into physical reality. He paced off the building's dimensions, marking corners with wooden stakes and checking angles with his father's carpenter square. Victoria watched his preparations with fascination, asking thoughtful questions about foundation depth and drainage requirements. Her eagerness to understand the technical details impressed Jasper, reminding him that teaching involved constant learning in subjects far removed from traditional classroom curriculum. "The foundation stones will need to come from Miller's quarry," Jasper explained, stretching string lines between the corner stakes. "Good limestone, properly cut. More expensive than fieldstone, but worth the investment for a permanent structure." "How long will the foundation work take?" Jasper calculated mentally, considering weather variables and the volunteer labor Victoria had promised. 3 weeks if we're lucky with rain and workforce. 4 if we're not." Victoria opened her portfolio and withdrew a list written in her precise handwriting. "I've organized the community volunteers by availability and skill level. Mrs. Henderson has arranged for daily meals, and Mr. Franklin believes he can recruit additional workers through the bank's business connections." The thoroughness of her preparation continued to amaze Jasper. She'd anticipated practical needs he hadn't even considered, from food service to skilled labor recruitment. Working with such an organized partner would be a new experience for someone accustomed to solitary projects. "We'll need to establish clear work schedules," Jasper said. "Construction sites can be dangerous with inexperienced help." Victoria nodded seriously. "I've researched safety protocols used by railroad construction crews. We should be able to adapt their methods for our purposes." They spent the afternoon refining construction plans and establishing protocols for volunteer coordination. Victoria proved surprisingly knowledgeable about practical logistics, her city background providing insights that complemented Jasper's rural experience. By evening, they'd created a comprehensive work schedule that balanced ambitious goals with realistic timelines. As the sun began setting behind the cottonwood grove, Victoria packed her materials with satisfied efficiency. "Mr. Hartwell, I want you to know how grateful I am for your help. This project means more to me than I can adequately express." Jasper coiled his measuring lines, uncomfortable with direct expressions of gratitude. "It's a good project. The children need a proper school." "It's more than that," Victoria said quietly. "When I left Philadelphia, I thought I was running away from something. But working on this schoolhouse with you, it feels like I'm finally running towards something worthwhile." The personal revelation surprised Jasper with its honesty. Most people, especially women of Victoria's social background, maintained careful privacy about their motivations and feelings. Her willingness to share genuine emotions spoke to a trust he wasn't sure he deserved. "Why did you leave Philadelphia?" he asked. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the western horizon where the last light was fading behind distant mountains. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of difficult decisions made in desperate circumstances. "I was engaged to a man chosen by my father. A business arrangement disguised as romance." She touched the cameo brooch at her throat, a delicate piece that seemed incongruous with her practical attire. "This belonged to my mother. She gave it to me before she died, along with advice about choosing love over convenience." The brooch was beautiful in an understated way. Its ivory profile carved with skilled artistry and set in gold that had aged to warm patina. Jasper recognized it as the kind of heirloom that connected generations, carrying family history in its elegant lines. "So you broke the engagement." "I disappeared 2 weeks before the wedding," Victoria admitted. "Left a letter explaining my decision and took the first train heading west. Not exactly honorable behavior, but I couldn't face a life of comfortable unhappiness." Her honesty deserved equal candor in return. "I married for love," Jasper said. "Sarah and I had 3 months of engagement, 13 months of marriage, and 15 years of my missing her. Sometimes I wonder if your approach isn't wiser." Victoria turned to study his profile in the gathering dusk. "Do you regret loving her?" The question struck deeper than Jasper had expected. "I regret that love wasn't enough to save her. I regret that caring so much made losing her nearly unbearable. But do you regret the loving itself?" Jasper considered the question seriously, remembering Sarah's laughter, the warmth of her hand in his, the way she'd made their small cabin feel like the center of the universe. Despite everything that followed, those 13 months remained the brightest period of his life. "No," he said finally, "I don't regret loving her." Victoria nodded with quiet satisfaction, as if his answer confirmed something important. "Then you understand why I had to choose the possibility of real love over the certainty of comfortable emptiness." They loaded the tools and drove back toward town in companionable silence, both lost in private thoughts about choices made and paths taken. The evening air carried the scent of wood smoke and approaching autumn, reminding them that winter would arrive sooner than seemed possible. As they approached Victoria's boarding house, she turned to face him with renewed determination. "Mr. Hartwell, I want you to know that whatever happens with this schoolhouse project, I'm grateful to have found someone who understands that some things are worth the risk of hoping." After helping her down from the wagon, Jasper watched Victoria disappear into the boarding house, her mother's cameo catching the lamplight from the front parlor window. The brooch represented more than family connection. It symbolized the courage to choose uncertain freedom over guaranteed security, a courage that had brought her west to build something meaningful from nothing but determination and hope. Driving home through the darkness, Jasper found himself thinking about risk and reward, about the difference between existing and living. For 15 years, he'd chosen the safety of solitude over the vulnerability of connection. But Victoria's project offered something he hadn't expected, the chance to build toward a future without abandoning respect for the past. At his cabin, he carefully returned his father's tools to their proper places, noting how right they felt in hands that remembered their weight and balance. Tomorrow would bring the real work, ordering materials, organizing volunteers, beginning the physical labor that would transform Victoria's dreams into solid reality. But tonight, for the first time in 15 years, Jasper allowed himself to imagine what it might feel like to create something beautiful with someone who shared his commitment to excellence. The possibility was both terrifying and irresistible, like standing at the edge of a cliff and discovering you remembered how to fly. As he prepared for sleep, Jasper pulled his father's silver pocket watch from his vest and opened it to check the time. Sarah's inscription caught the lamplight. "All my time is yours, my love." But instead of the familiar pang of loss, he felt something approaching peace. Sarah's love had been a gift that didn't diminish with time or sharing. Perhaps it was possible to honor that gift by opening his heart to new possibilities. The watch ticked steadily in his palm, marking moments that led toward an uncertain but no longer empty future. Construction on the Cedar Ridge schoolhouse began on a crisp October morning that promised both progress and complications. Jasper arrived at the building site before dawn, using the early quiet to organize tools and materials while his mind worked through the day's challenges. The foundation stones from Miller's quarry had arrived the previous afternoon, their limestone surfaces gleaming pale gold in the wagon beds like promises of permanence. Victoria appeared as the sun crested the eastern hills, carrying a coffee pot and basket of warm biscuits that would become the first of many shared breakfasts at the construction site. She traded her usual teaching dress for a practical brown skirt and white blouse that could withstand the dust and activity of building work, her hair braided in a style that wouldn't interfere with physical labor. "Good morning, Mr. Hartwell," she said, pouring coffee into his offered cup. "Are you ready to make history?" Jasper accepted the coffee gratefully, noting how Victoria's presence had already begun to feel natural in his carefully ordered world. "History might be overstating things, but we'll certainly make a schoolhouse." By 8 o'clock, a dozen volunteers had gathered at the site, representing a cross-section of Cedar Ridge's working population. Henry Morrison arrived with his characteristic enthusiasm and complete lack of construction experience. Bank President Franklin brought ledgers to track expenses, but proved surprisingly capable with a shovel. Mrs. Henderson supervised food preparation while keeping one eye on her husband's excavation. The technique, Jasper quickly realized that managing volunteer labor required diplomatic skills he'd never developed during his solitary years. Each helper brought willing effort, combined with personal opinions about proper construction methods, creating a democracy of good intentions that threatened to overwhelm practical progress. "Mr. Morrison," Jasper said patiently, "the foundation trenches need to be exactly 18 inches deep. Deeper wastes effort, shallower compromises the building's stability." Henry paused in his enthusiastic but inconsistent digging. "My father always said foundations should go down to solid rock." "Your father was right for permanent structures like houses," Victoria interjected diplomatically. "But schoolhouses have different requirements based on their intended use and local soil conditions." Her ability to mediate between Jasper's technical expertise and the volunteers' folk wisdom proved invaluable throughout the morning. She'd researched enough construction principles to speak knowledgeably with experienced builders while remaining humble enough to defer to Jasper's superior skill and judgment. The foundation work progressed steadily despite occasional debates about methodology. Jasper found himself grudgingly impressed by the community's dedication, watching farmers and shopkeepers labor beside railroad workers and ranch hands in pursuit of a shared goal. The project was creating unexpected connections between people who'd previously interacted only through business transactions. During the midday break, while volunteers gathered around Mrs. Henderson's impressive lunch spread, Jasper and Victoria walked the building's perimeter to check progress and plan afternoon work. The foundation trenches formed clean lines across the donated ground, marking the schoolhouse's footprint with mathematical precision. "It's starting to look real," Victoria said, her voice mixing satisfaction with lingering amazement at the project's forward momentum. Jasper nodded, studying the excavation with professional satisfaction. Foundation's the most important part. Everything else depends on getting this right. They paused at the spot where the front entrance would eventually stand, both imagining the finished building that existed now only in Victoria's drawings and their shared vision. The location commanded an impressive view of Cedar Ridge and the surrounding valley, a perspective that would remind students daily of their connection to the growing community. "Mr. Hartwell," Victoria said quietly, "there's something I need to tell you about the project funding." Jasper turned to study her expression, noting the careful control that suggested difficult news. "What kind of something?" Victoria withdrew a letter from her skirt pocket, the envelope bearing an official seal that Jasper didn't recognize. "This arrived yesterday from the Territorial Education Department. They're offering to match local contributions dollar for dollar if we meet certain construction standards." The news should have been cause for celebration, but Victoria's troubled expression suggested complications. "What's the difficulty?" "The standards include requirements for building materials, classroom capacity, and teacher certification that go beyond what we originally planned." Victoria unfolded the letter, pointing to specific paragraphs. "They want proof of fire-resistant construction, adequate ventilation systems, and library facilities that would nearly double our current budget." Jasper read through the territorial requirements, recognizing the bureaucratic tendency to impose distant regulations on local projects. The standards were sensible but expensive, transforming Victoria's ambitious but achievable vision into something approaching the impossible. "How much additional money are we talking about?" Victoria consulted notes written in her precise handwriting. "Approximately $800 beyond our current funding commitments. The community has raised $300 through donations and pledges. The territorial match would provide another $300, but meeting their standards would cost at least $1,400 total." The numbers represented more money than most Cedar Ridge families saw in 2 years, a sum that would require either wealthy benefactors or extended debt arrangements that could burden the community for decades. Jasper felt the familiar weight of projects that grew beyond reasonable boundaries, threatening to collapse under their own ambitions. "We could scale back the design," he suggested. "Build something smaller that meets the basic requirements without the expensive additions." Victoria's green eyes flashed with stubborn determination. "Or we could find a way to meet the higher standards and create something truly exceptional." "From where?" "The territorial government isn't handing out money without strings attached, and local resources are already stretched thin." Victoria folded the letter carefully, her movements betraying the internal calculation of someone accustomed to solving difficult problems through creative thinking. "I have some ideas, but they'll require taking risks that might make people uncomfortable." Before Jasper could ask for details, Henry Morrison's voice carried across the construction site, calling them back to afternoon work. The conversation ended without resolution, but Victoria's thoughtful expression suggested she was already developing plans that might address their funding crisis. The afternoon brought steady progress as volunteers settled into efficient work rhythms. Jasper supervised stone laying while Victoria coordinated material distribution, their partnership finding natural balance between his technical expertise and her organizational skills. By evening, the foundation's first course was complete. Limestone blocks fitted with the precision that would support decades of educational service. As volunteers gathered their tools and prepared to leave, several offered observations that warmed Jasper's professional pride. The foundation looked solid, permanent, worthy of the community investment it represented. Children who attended the finished school would learn in a building constructed with genuine craftsmanship, not merely functional adequacy. After the others departed, Victoria and Jasper remained at the site to secure materials and plan the following day's work. The evening light cast long shadows across their progress, emphasizing how much had been accomplished and how much remained to be done. "Mr. Hartwell," Victoria said, organizing papers in her ever-present portfolio, "I want you to know that whatever difficulties we face with funding or regulations, I'm committed to seeing this project completed properly. Jasper sensed deeper meaning beneath her words. What aren't you telling me about those ideas you mentioned? Victoria hesitated, clearly weighing the wisdom of sharing information that might complicate their partnership. There are people back east who might be willing to invest in Western education projects. People with money and social consciences who see frontier schools as worthy causes. People connected to your former life. Some of them! Victoria's voice carried reluctance mixed with determination. My father has business associates who've expressed interest in Western development. Not all of them approved of his plans for my marriage. The implications troubled Jasper more than he wanted to admit. Accepting financial help from Victoria's Eastern connections would bind their project to social obligations and expectations that might prove more burdensome than territorial regulations. That kind of help usually comes with conditions, he said. Victoria nodded seriously. Which is why I haven't contacted them yet. But if it means the difference between building something exceptional and building something merely adequate, don't decide anything without discussing it with me first, Jasper interrupted. Projects that start simple have a way of becoming complicated when outside money gets involved, Victoria agreed. Loaded tools into Jasper's wagon for the return trip to town. The funding crisis represented more than a financial challenge. It was a test of whether their shared vision could survive the practical pressures that destroyed so many ambitious undertakings. As they drove through the gathering dusk, Jasper found himself thinking about Sarah's wedding ring, still carried in his vest pocket after 15 years of widowhood. He'd kept it as a talisman of permanent love, but lately it felt more like a chain binding him to the past. Perhaps it was time to consider whether holding on to beautiful memories required rejecting the possibility of beautiful futures. The ring caught the lamplight from Victoria's boarding house as she gathered her belongings, a circle of gold that had once symbolized infinite promise. Sarah would have wanted him to be happy, would have encouraged him to take risks for worthy causes and meaningful connections. Maybe honoring her memory meant learning to hope again, even if hope invited the possibility of loss. Victoria paused before leaving the wagon, her hand briefly touching the cameo at her throat in a gesture that had become familiar during their weeks of collaboration. Thank you for today, Mr. Hartwell. Despite the complications, it felt like we accomplished something important. Jasper watched her disappear into the boarding house, carrying the territorial letter that would shape their project's future in ways neither could fully predict. The schoolhouse foundation gleamed pale in the moonlight, solid and permanent despite the uncertainties surrounding its completion. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever compromises or complications emerged from funding requirements and community expectations, Jasper knew he was committed to seeing Victoria's vision realized. The work was changing him in ways he hadn't expected, awakening ambitions and connections he'd thought permanently buried. For the first time in 15 years, building something beautiful felt worth the risk of caring about its outcome. The funding crisis deepened over the following week as Victoria researched territorial requirements with her characteristic thoroughness. Each regulation seemed designed to protect students and ensure quality education, but their cumulative cost threatened to make the project impossible for a community of Cedar Ridge's limited resources. Jasper found Victoria in the schoolhouse storage room one evening, surrounded by correspondence and calculations. Her teaching certificate displayed prominently on the makeshift desk, as if to remind herself of her qualifications for the challenge ahead. The official document, signed by the Pennsylvania Board of Education and bearing an impressive seal, represented years of study and preparation that had brought her west to this moment of crisis. How bad is it? Jasper asked, settling onto a wooden crate that served as the room's only additional seating. Victoria looked up from her papers, exhaustion evident in the set of her shoulders despite her determined expression. Worse than I initially calculated. The territorial standards require brick construction for fire safety, imported glass for adequate natural light, and ventilation systems that need specialized metalwork. We're looking at nearly $2,000 total. The figure represented impossible wealth for most frontier communities. Jasper had seen ambitious projects collapse under far less financial pressure, leaving behind foundations that gradually filled with weeds and broken promises. Maybe we should reconsider the scope, he suggested. Build something smaller that meets basic requirements. Without the expensive additions, Victoria's green eyes flashed with stubborn determination that reminded Jasper of storm clouds gathering before a prairie tempest. These children deserve more than basic requirements. Mr. Hartwell, they deserve a school that tells them their education matters, that their community believes in their potential. She gestured toward the cramped storage room with its inadequate lighting and poor ventilation. Look at this space. Look at how these children have to learn, crowded together without proper desks or decent air to breathe. If we're going to build a new school, shouldn't we build something that honors their intelligence and ambition? Jasper understood her passion, but also recognized the practical impossibilities they faced. Honor doesn't pay for imported materials or specialized construction. Victoria stood and moved to the single window, gazing out at the construction site where their foundation stones gleamed pale in the moonlight. I've been corresponding with some of my father's business associates, men who've invested in railroad development and western expansion ventures. The news didn't surprise Jasper, but it troubled him more than he wanted to admit. Eastern money always came with Eastern expectations, obligations that could transform their community project into something controlled by distant interests. What kind of investors? Victoria returned to her desk and withdrew a carefully written letter bearing elegant letterhead. Mr. Charles Whitmore of the Philadelphia Development Consortium. He specializes in educational and civic projects in growing western towns. Jasper recognized the type, wealthy philanthropists who saw frontier development as both profitable investment and moral obligation. Such men often had genuine good intentions, but they also had definite ideas about how their money should be used. What does he want in return? Naming rights, progress reports, and assurance that the school will meet Eastern educational standards. Victoria's voice carried reluctance mixed with pragmatic acceptance. He's offering to fund half the construction cost in exchange for having the building called the Whitmore Community School. The proposed arrangement was more generous than Jasper had expected, but naming rights represented permanent commitment to obligations they couldn't fully predict. Future generations would attend the Whitmore School, bound to honor agreements made in desperate circumstances. There's something else, Victoria continued, her voice dropping to careful neutrality. Mr. Whitmore wants to send a representative to oversee construction and ensure proper fund utilization. Jasper felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came with projects growing beyond local control. What kind of representative? A building supervisor with authority to approve expenditures and modify construction plans as necessary to meet investor requirements. The arrangement would effectively remove final decision-making from community hands, placing Victoria's carefully designed schoolhouse under the control of someone chosen by distant benefactors. Jasper had seen such arrangements destroy projects more often than save them. That changes everything about how we work, he said. Victoria nodded seriously. I know, but without outside funding, we can't build the school these children need. We'll have to choose between compromising our vision and accepting external oversight. They sat in silence for several minutes, both calculating the costs of different forms of surrender. Through the storage room's single window, the foundation of their partially built schoolhouse was visible in the moonlight. Solid stone waiting for decisions that would determine its future. There's another option, Jasper said finally. We could approach the territorial government directly, explain our situation, and ask for modified requirements that fit community resources. Victoria's expression suggested she'd already considered and dismissed this possibility. I tried that approach last week. The territorial education supervisor was sympathetic but inflexible. Standards are standards, he said, designed to protect students regardless of local financial limitations. The bureaucratic response was typical but frustrating. Distant officials created regulations without considering their impact on specific communities, leaving local leaders to choose between impossible compliance and inadequate alternatives. So we're back to Eastern funding or reduced scope, unless you can think of a third option I've missed. Jasper studied Victoria's teaching certificate, noting the careful penmanship and official seals that validated her professional credentials. She'd worked hard to earn the right to teach, had sacrificed comfortable security for the opportunity to educate frontier children. The prospect of external oversight threatening her pedagogical autonomy must be particularly galling. What would this supervisor have authority to change? Victoria consulted her correspondence. Building materials, classroom layout, library specifications, even teaching methods if they conflict with approved educational practices. Teaching methods? Mr. Whitmore believes in standardized curricula based on Eastern models. His representative would ensure that Cedar Ridge students receive instruction comparable to their Philadelphia counterparts. The requirement sounded reasonable in principle, but troubling in practice. Eastern educational methods might not serve frontier children who needed practical skills alongside academic knowledge. Victoria's teaching philosophy emphasized adapting instruction to student needs rather than forcing students to adapt to rigid curricula. You'd lose control of your own classroom. Victoria's composed facade cracked slightly, revealing the fear beneath her professional determination. Perhaps, but losing some autonomy might be acceptable if it means providing better facilities and resources. Jasper stood and moved to examine the teaching certificate more closely, noting dates and signatures that documented Victoria's qualification for educational leadership. She'd earned the right to make pedagogical decisions based on training and experience that few frontier teachers possessed. "Miss Summers," he said carefully, "this certificate represents your professional identity. Don't surrender it lightly for money that comes with strings attached." Victoria joined him at the desk, her fingers tracing the certificate's ornate border with obvious pride and affection. "My grandfather always said that sometimes you have to risk what you value most to protect what you love most." "And what do you love most?" Victoria's gaze moved from the certificate to the window overlooking their construction site, then returned to meet his eyes with quiet intensity. "The possibility that education can transform lives. The chance that children in Cedar Ridge might dream bigger dreams, because they learned in a beautiful building designed specifically for their growth and development." Her passionate conviction reminded Jasper why he'd agreed to undertake the project. Despite his preference for solitary work, Victoria's vision extended beyond mere construction to encompass community, transformation through educational excellence. "Then we need to find a way to build your school without compromising your teaching," Jasper said. "Even if it means taking risks that make us both uncomfortable." Victoria's smile was radiant with gratitude and renewed hope. "Do you have something in mind?" Jasper pulled his father's silver pocket watch from his vest, opening it to reveal Sarah's inscription gleaming in the lamplight. The watch represented his most precious connection to the past. But perhaps it was time to consider whether honoring memory required investing in the future. "I might be able to contribute more than just labor," he said quietly. "I've got some savings put aside, money I never expected to need for anything important." Victoria studied his expression with careful attention, clearly recognizing the significance of his offer. "Mr. Hartwell, I couldn't ask you to risk your personal savings on this project. You're not asking. I'm offering." Jasper closed the watch and returned it to his pocket, feeling lighter despite the weight of financial commitment. Sarah always believed education was the best investment anyone could make. Maybe it's time I acted on that belief. The evening air carried the scent of autumn through the storage room's open window, reminding them both that winter would arrive sooner than seemed possible. Their schoolhouse foundation was solid, but the building's completion depended on decisions that would shape Cedar Ridge's educational future for generations. "How much can you contribute?" Victoria asked. "Enough to reduce our dependence on Eastern money." Maybe enough to negotiate better terms if we do need outside funding. Victoria began calculating furiously, her pen scratching across paper as she revised budget estimates and funding requirements. Within minutes, she'd created a new financial plan that balanced community resources, territorial requirements, and reduced external obligations. This could work, she said, excitement building in her voice. We'd still need some outside funding, but not enough to surrender complete control. Mr. Whitmore might accept modified involvement if we can demonstrate substantial local investment. Jasper watched Victoria's renewed energy with satisfaction, understanding that hope was often more valuable than money in determining project success. Together, they might find a way to build something exceptional without sacrificing the community ownership that made the project meaningful as they prepared to leave the storage room schoolhouse. For the last time as their primary educational facility, Victoria carefully rolled her teaching certificate and secured it in her portfolio alongside the architectural drawings that had started everything. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, "whatever happens with funding and construction, I want you to know that working with you has already changed my life in ways I couldn't have imagined." Jasper helped her gather the correspondence and calculations that would determine their next steps, noting how natural their partnership had become, despite the significant risks they were undertaking together. "Mine too, Miss Summers," he admitted. "Mine too." Construction resumed with renewed vigor after Jasper's financial commitment resolved their most pressing funding concerns. The schoolhouse walls rose steadily through late October, limestone and timber framing creating the skeleton of Victoria's educational vision. Community volunteers worked with increased confidence, knowing their project could be completed without surrendering control to distant benefactors. Victoria threw herself into the construction work with an energy that impressed even seasoned builders. She learned to mix mortar, carry lumber, and operate hand tools with growing competence, her teaching dress replaced by practical work clothes that marked her transformation from visiting educator to permanent community member. Jasper found himself looking forward to their daily collaboration with an anticipation that surprised him. Victoria's presence had gradually become essential to his daily routine, her thoughtful questions and creative problem-solving enriching the construction process beyond mere physical labor. The first signs of trouble appeared on a grey November morning when a stranger rode into Cedar Ridge asking pointed questions about the schoolhouse project. The man introduced himself as Thomas Ashford, representing Eastern business interests, and spent considerable time examining the construction site with the calculating attention of someone conducting an investigation. Henry Morrison, ever eager to share information with visitors, provided Ashford with detailed accounts of the project's funding, community support, and the key roles played by Victoria and Jasper. The stranger listened with polite interest, taking notes in a leather journal that suggested official business rather than casual curiosity. Victoria first learned of Ashford's presence when Mrs. Patterson mentioned the visitor. During their evening meal at the boarding house, the landlady described him as a well-dressed gentleman with refined manners and persistent interest in the new schoolteacher's background and qualifications. He asked particular questions about your teaching certificate and previous experience, Mrs. Patterson reported. Seemed to know quite a bit about Eastern educational standards. Victoria felt a chill of apprehension that had nothing to do with the approaching winter weather. Visitors with detailed knowledge of her professional background were unlikely to be coincidental, especially when they appeared during a construction project funded partially through Eastern connections. The next morning, Victoria found Ashford waiting outside the schoolhouse construction site, his expensive clothing and polished boots marking him as clearly foreign to frontier work environments. He approached her with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to getting answers to difficult questions. "Miss Summers, I presume," he said, removing his hat with practiced courtesy. "I'm Thomas Ashford, representing the Hartford Investment Group of Philadelphia. I believe we have mutual acquaintances." Victoria's stomach tightened with recognition and dread. The Hartford group was connected to her father's business network, the same circle of influential men who had arranged her engagement to Preston Blackwood. Ashford's presence in Cedar Ridge could only mean that her carefully constructed new life was about to collide with the past she'd tried to escape. "I'm not familiar with the Hartford Investment Group," Victoria replied, keeping her voice level despite her racing pulse. "Are you interested in our construction project?" Ashford smiled, with the practiced charm of someone skilled in extracting information from reluctant subjects. "Among other things. But I'm primarily here because of a letter I received from a concerned party back east, someone who's been quite worried about your sudden departure from Philadelphia." Victoria felt the careful world she'd built in Cedar Ridge beginning to crack around the edges. "I'm afraid I don't understand your meaning, Mr. Ashford. Preston Blackwood sends his regards," Ashford said, watching her face carefully for reaction. "He's been quite concerned about your welfare since you disappeared so abruptly before your wedding. He asked me to locate you and ensure your safety." The name hit Victoria like a physical blow, bringing back memories of suffocating social expectations and the arranged marriage that had driven her west. Preston Blackwood represented everything she'd fled: wealth without purpose, privilege without responsibility, her future mapped out by others for their benefit rather than her own. "Mr. Blackwood has no claim on my welfare," Victoria said, proud that her voice remained steady. "Our engagement was dissolved when I left Philadelphia." Ashford consulted his leather journal, reading from notes with bureaucratic precision. "Actually, Miss Summers, no formal dissolution was ever filed. According to Pennsylvania law, your departure constituted breach of contract rather than legitimate termination of engagement." The legal technicality was typical of Preston's methodical approach to personal relationships. He would use every available mechanism to maintain control, even over a woman who'd clearly rejected his proposal. "What does Mr. Blackwood want?" "Your return to Philadelphia to fulfill your original commitment," Ashford replied. "He's prepared to be quite generous about the delay, understanding that young women sometimes experience pre-wedding nervousness." Victoria's hands clenched into fists, anger overriding her initial fear. "And if I refuse?" Ashford's expression grew regretful, as if he genuinely disliked the implications of his message. "Mr. Blackwood has made substantial investments in Western development projects, including educational initiatives in frontier communities. He has considerable influence with territorial authorities regarding school funding and teacher certification requirements." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Preston could use his financial connections to destroy the schoolhouse project and potentially revoke Victoria's teaching credentials, leaving both her dreams and the community's educational hopes in ruins. "How did you find me?" Victoria asked, though she suspected the answer. "Your correspondence with Charles Whitmore regarding school funding. Mr. Whitmore and Mr. Blackwood have extensive business relationships. When your name appeared in connection with a Western school project, Mr. Blackwood recognized the opportunity to locate his missing fiancée." Victoria realized with growing horror that her attempts to secure funding for the schoolhouse had inadvertently revealed her location to the very people she'd fled. Her efforts to build something meaningful had become the means of her potential capture. "I need time to consider your message," Victoria said, though her mind was already racing through possible responses and escape routes. Ashford nodded with apparent understanding. "Of course, Mr. Blackwood is a reasonable man. He's prepared to give you until the end of the week to make proper arrangements for your return journey. And if I don't return voluntarily, he'd prefer not to explore less pleasant alternatives," Ashford replied. "But he's quite determined to resolve this matter satisfactorily. Your wedding has been postponed, not cancelled." After Ashford departed, Victoria stood alone at the construction site, surrounded by the rising walls of her educational dream, while feeling trapped by circumstances beyond her control. The schoolhouse that had represented freedom and purpose now seemed like evidence of her vulnerability. a permanent structure that had made her too easy to locate and threaten. Jasper found her there an hour later, recognizing immediately that something significant had disturbed her usual composed demeanor. She stood motionless among the building materials, staring at the half-completed structure with an expression of profound sadness. "Victoria," he said, using her given name for the first time since their partnership began. "What's happened?" She turned to face him, her green eyes bright with unshed tears and barely controlled anger. "They found me, Jasper. My past has caught up with our future." Victoria told him about Ashford's visit, Preston's demands, and the threats against their school project with the clinical precision of someone reporting facts too painful for emotional processing. Jasper listened with growing fury, understanding that forces beyond their control were threatening to destroy everything they'd worked to build. "This, Blackwood," Jasper said when she'd finished. "What kind of man is he?" Victoria's expression grew thoughtful, as if she were seeing her former fiancé clearly for the first time. Wealthy, powerful, accustomed to having his preferences treated as commands. He sees marriage as a business arrangement and women as assets to be acquired and managed. And he has the influence to shut down our school? Probably. His family controls significant railroad investments and banking interests throughout Pennsylvania and the territories. If he decided to oppose our project, Victoria's voice trailed off, but the implications were clear. Preston Blackwood possessed the financial resources and political connections to make life very difficult for anyone who defied his wishes, especially a runaway fiancée and her frontier allies. "What are you going to do?" Jasper asked, though he dreaded the possible answers. Victoria walked to the schoolhouse's future entrance, placing her hand on the stone threshold they'd laid together weeks earlier. "I don't know. If I refuse to return, he'll destroy this school and ruin your investment. If I go back to Philadelphia," she paused, unable to voice the surrender that acceptance would represent. Jasper moved to stand beside her, close enough to offer support without presuming too much familiarity. "There has to be another option, such as? We could finish the school quickly, before he has time to interfere. Present the territorial authorities with a completed building that meets all requirements." Victoria shook her head sadly. "Even if we could accomplish that, he'd find other ways to maintain control. Men like Preston don't accept defiance gracefully." They stood together in the afternoon shadow of their half-built dream, both understanding that their partnership faced challenges more dangerous than funding shortages or construction delays. External enemies with vast resources and ruthless determination posed threats that couldn't be solved through hard work and community spirit. As evening approached, Victoria made a decision that surprised Jasper with its quiet courage. "I won't run again," she said. "Whatever happens with Preston's demands, I won't abandon this school or this community, even if it means risking everything you've built here." Victoria touched the cameo at her throat, her mother's legacy reminding her of the courage required to choose authentic life over comfortable security. "Especially then. If I've learned anything during these months in Cedar Ridge, it's that some things are worth fighting for, regardless of the odds." Jasper felt a surge of admiration for Victoria's determination, recognizing in her resolve the same stubborn courage that had brought her west in the first place. But he also understood that fighting Preston Blackwood would require more than individual bravery. It would demand strategic planning and community support against enemies who played by different rules. That evening, alone in his cabin, Jasper made his own decision about the challenges they faced. He pulled Sarah's wedding ring from the drawer where he'd kept it for 15 years, studying the simple gold band that had symbolized his retreat from hope and connection. Sarah would have wanted him to fight for Victoria and their shared dreams. She would have encouraged him to take risks for worthy causes, even if those risks invited the possibility of loss. It was time to honor her memory by choosing courage over caution, love over safety. The ring caught the lamplight one final time before Jasper placed it carefully in his vest pocket beside his father's watch. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult choices, but tonight he allowed himself to hope that some battles were worth fighting, regardless of their outcome. The news of Thomas Ashford's ultimatum spread through Cedar Ridge with the speed that only small communities can achieve, each retelling adding layers of outrage and protective concern for their schoolteacher. By evening, an impromptu town meeting had convened in Morrison's general store, with citizens crowding between the shelves of goods to debate how their community should respond to eastern threats. Jasper arrived to find Victoria standing near the store's back wall, her composure intact, despite the dozens of eyes fixed on her with mixture of sympathy and curiosity. She'd changed from her work clothes into her best teaching dress, the dark blue wool lending her an air of professional authority that reminded everyone present why they'd invested so much in her educational vision. Henry Morrison called the meeting to order with characteristic enthusiasm, his merchant's instincts recognizing an opportunity to demonstrate community solidarity. "Folks, we're here because someone's threatening our school teacher and our school project. I figure we ought to discuss what we're going to do about it." Bank President Franklin stood first, his financial training evident in the careful precision of his words. "Miss Summers, could you explain exactly what this Ashford fellow told you? We need to understand the full scope of the threats we're facing." Victoria repeated Ashford's message with clinical accuracy, omitting nothing about Preston Blackwood's demands or his potential influence over territorial education authorities. Her honesty impressed Jasper, who recognized how difficult it must be to expose her private history to public scrutiny. When she finished, the store fell silent, except for the ticking of Morrison's wall clock and the creak of wooden shelves settling under the weight of assembled citizens. Finally, Mrs. Henderson spoke up with the practical directness that had made her a community leader. "Seems to me this Blackwood fellow thinks he can push around folks who don't have his kind of money and connections," she said. "Question is whether we're going to let him." "Easy to say we won't," replied Jim Patterson, Mrs. Patterson's husband and one of the construction volunteers. "Harder to know what we can actually do against someone with that kind of influence." Jasper felt the familiar tension of communities facing challenges beyond their immediate control. Cedar Ridge was a small town with limited resources, and Preston Blackwood represented the kind of established power that could crush frontier dreams without significant effort. "Maybe we should hear what Miss Summers wants to do," suggested Dr. Matthews, the town's physician and one of its most respected voices. "This is her fight more than ours." All eyes turned to Victoria, who straightened her shoulders with visible determination. "I appreciate everyone's concern, but I won't allow my personal problems to destroy what we've built together. If returning to Philadelphia is the only way to protect this school and this community, then perhaps that's what I should do." Her words triggered immediate protests from multiple directions. Children's voices could be heard outside the store, drawn by the unusual evening activity, their presence reminding everyone what was truly at stake in the confrontation. "Now hold on," said Morrison, his voice carrying unusual gravity. "This school project isn't just about one person, even someone as fine as Miss Summers. It's about what kind of community we want to be. Do we fold up every time someone with money tries to tell us what to do?" Franklin nodded agreement, surprising those who knew his typically cautious nature. "Henry's right. If we let outside pressure dictate our educational choices, what's next? Will distant investors start controlling our businesses? Our local government?" Jasper recognized the moment when a community decides whether to stand together or surrender to superior force. Cedar Ridge was choosing its character, deciding what principles were worth defending regardless of personal cost. "There's something else to consider," Jasper said, standing so his voice would carry clearly through the crowded store. "This Blackwood might have influence with territorial authorities, but those authorities still have to follow legal procedures. They can't just shut down a school without proper cause. Victoria's teaching certificate, carefully preserved in her portfolio, represented more than personal qualification. It was legal documentation that couldn't be dismissed without due process. Even wealthy men like Preston Blackwood had to work within established systems, at least initially. "What are you thinking, Jasper?" asked Dr. Matthews. Jasper felt the attention of his neighbors focused on him with unusual intensity, recognizing that his words might determine their community's response to external threats. The responsibility was heavier than any construction project he'd undertaken. "I'm thinking we finish this school as quickly as possible," he said. "Present the territorial authorities with a completed building that exceeds all requirements. Make it harder for anyone to find legal grounds for interference." The proposal sparked immediate discussion about timelines, workforce availability, and material requirements. Victoria pulled out her construction schedules, calculating what would be needed to complete the project within weeks rather than months. "It's possible," she said, after consulting her notes. "If we can organize round-the-clock work shifts and concentrate all available labor on essential tasks." Morrison began tallying. "Volunteer commitments with the enthusiasm of someone planning a military campaign. I can close the store early every day to work on construction." "Patterson, what about you?" The responses came quickly. Offers of extended volunteer hours, additional materials, specialized skills that hadn't been previously available. The threat to their community had mobilized resources that normal circumstances couldn't have accessed. Mrs. Henderson appointed herself coordinator of food service for the expanded construction effort. "Can't have folks working double shifts without proper meals. I'll organize the women to provide breakfast, dinner, and late evening sustenance." As the meeting continued, Jasper noticed Victoria's expression changing from resignation to cautious hope. The community's determination to protect both her and their shared project was clearly overwhelming, touching something deep in her Eastern-educated but increasingly Western heart. "There's still the question of Blackwood's deadline," Franklin pointed out. "If we don't complete the school before he takes more direct action, then we deal with whatever action he takes," Jasper said firmly. "But we do it as a community that's already accomplished what we set out to do." The meeting gradually transformed from crisis response to tactical planning, with citizens organizing themselves into work crews, supply coordinators, and communication networks. Cedar Ridge was preparing for the kind of coordinated effort that frontier communities could mount when survival or principles were at stake. After the formal meeting ended, small groups continued discussing logistics and contingency plans, while Victoria and Jasper remained to finalize construction schedules. The store's lamplight cast long shadows across Morrison's shelves, emphasizing how late the evening had become. "I can't believe they're willing to do this," Victoria said quietly, reviewing the volunteer commitments that would make accelerated construction possible. "They're not just doing it for you," Jasper replied. "They're doing it for themselves, for their children, for the kind of community they want Cedar Ridge to become." Victoria carefully folded her construction schedules and placed them in her portfolio, alongside her teaching certificate and the architectural drawings that had started everything. "Still, without your leadership, they might have decided differently." Jasper felt uncomfortable with credit for community decisions that represented collective courage rather than individual influence. They made their own choice about what was worth defending. As they prepared to leave Morrison's store, Victoria paused to examine Jasper's father's rifle, which he'd brought to the meeting in case circumstances required more than verbal resistance. The weapon represented his family's frontier heritage and the practical reality that some conflicts couldn't be resolved through negotiation alone. "Do you think it will come to violence?" Victoria asked. "I hope not," Jasper replied honestly. "But men like Blackwood sometimes use force when legal pressure doesn't achieve their goals quickly enough." Victoria nodded seriously, understanding that their accelerated construction schedule was really a race against escalating confrontation. "Then we'd better make sure we win that race." The next morning brought unseasonably warm weather and the largest volunteer workforce Cedar Ridge had ever assembled for a single project. Men arrived before dawn carrying tools and determination, while women organized cooking, stations and childcare arrangements that would allow maximum community participation. Jasper found himself coordinating multiple construction crews with skills he'd never needed during his solitary years. Victoria moved between groups, offering encouragement and practical assistance. Her teaching abilities adapted to the challenge of managing adult learners in an outdoor classroom. By midday, the schoolhouse walls had risen visibly higher, and the roof framing was beginning to take shape. The accelerated pace required careful attention to safety and quality control, but the work proceeded with remarkable efficiency considering the number of inexperienced volunteers involved. Dr. Matthews arrived during the afternoon break, bringing news that sobered everyone's enthusiasm. Thomas Ashford was asking questions at the hotel this morning, specific questions about property ownership, territorial jurisdiction, and legal procedures for challenging educational institutions. The information confirmed Jasper's suspicion that Preston Blackwood was preparing more than social pressure to reclaim his runaway fiancée. Legal challenges and official interference would follow if Victoria continued to resist his demands. "How much time do we have?" Victoria asked. Matthews consulted his pocket watch, a gesture that reminded Jasper of his own father's timepiece and the precious hours that were slipping away. Ashford mentioned expecting communications from Philadelphia within 2 days. "My guess is that Blackwood's planning to escalate this situation very soon." Victoria absorbed the timeline with visible tension, calculating construction requirements against the approaching deadline. "We need to work through the night if we're going to complete the essential structure in time." The prospect of night construction brought additional challenges: lighting, safety, coordination of exhausted workers, but the community accepted these difficulties with grim determination. Cedar Ridge had committed to finishing their school regardless of external pressure. As evening approached, Jasper organized work crews for the night shift, while Victoria coordinated lighting arrangements and meal schedules. Their partnership had evolved into something approaching military efficiency, with each anticipating the other's needs and decisions. "Jasper," Victoria said during a brief private moment, "I want you to know that whatever happens in the next few days, working with you on this project has been the most meaningful experience of my life." Her words carried weight that extended beyond professional collaboration, touching on the personal connection that had grown between them through weeks of shared labor and common purpose. Jasper felt the same depth of meaning, understanding that their schoolhouse had become something more than an educational facility. "Mine too," he replied simply, knowing that Victoria would understand everything he couldn't say about hope, fear, and the possibility of love discovered in unexpected circumstances. The night shift began with lanterns and torches, casting dancing shadows across the construction site, transforming the familiar workspace into something dramatic and urgent. Community members who had never worked together found themselves side by side, united by determination to protect their teacher and complete their school. As Jasper supervised the critical roof work that would make their building weatherproof, he carried his father's rifle within easy reach, understanding that Cedar Ridge's next few days would determine whether small communities could still protect their own against the influence of distant wealth and power. The confrontation began at dawn on the 3rd day, when 4 riders approached Cedar Ridge from the east, their expensive horses and formal travel clothes marking them as distinctly foreign to frontier life. Preston Blackwood had arrived with his promised reinforcements, choosing to settle the matter personally rather than trusting further negotiations to intermediaries. Jasper spotted the riders first from his position on the schoolhouse roof, where he'd been supervising the final installation of weatherproofing materials. The building was nearly complete, its limestone walls and timber framing creating the substantial structure that Victoria had envisioned months earlier. One more day would see the interior finished and ready for territorial inspection. "Victoria," Jasper called down from the roof. "We have visitors." She emerged from the schoolhouse where she'd been organizing desks and educational materials donated by community families. The approaching riders commanded her immediate attention, and Jasper saw her face pale with recognition. As she identified the lead horseman, Preston, Blackwood was exactly what Jasper had expected, a man in his 30s with the bearing of inherited wealth and practiced authority. His dark hair was perfectly groomed, despite the long journey from Philadelphia, and his clothing showed quality tailoring that probably cost more than most. Cedar Ridge families earned in 6 months. The 3 men accompanying Blackwood appeared to be professional enforcers rather than business associates, their alert postures and carefully positioned weapons suggesting experience with situations that required more than financial pressure. Jasper felt his hand drift toward his father's rifle, understanding that the confrontation might escalate beyond verbal negotiations. By the time the riders reached the schoolhouse site, a crowd had begun gathering as word spread through Cedar Ridge that their threatened teacher's past had finally arrived to claim her. Henry Morrison closed his store to join the assembly, while Dr. Matthews positioned himself where he could provide medical assistance if circumstances required. Preston Blackwood dismounted with practiced elegance, his gaze moving appreciatively over the nearly completed building, before settling on Victoria with the satisfied expression of someone who'd successfully tracked valuable property. "Victoria, my dear," he said, approaching her with arms extended as if expecting an embrace. "I've been quite worried about your welfare during this extended adventure." Victoria stepped back, maintaining careful distance between herself and the man she'd fled across a continent to avoid. "Preston, I didn't expect you to travel so far from your usual territory. When one's fiancé disappears so dramatically, personal attention becomes necessary." Blackwood's voice carried the smooth charm of practiced manipulation, but his eyes held calculation rather than affection. "I trust you've enjoyed your frontier experience, but it's time to return to more civilized circumstances." The town charter lay displayed prominently on a makeshift table near the schoolhouse entrance, its official seals and legal language providing documentary evidence of Cedar Ridge's legitimate authority to govern local affairs, including educational institutions. Jasper had positioned the document strategically, knowing that even wealthy men like Blackwood had to respect established legal frameworks. "I'm afraid I won't be returning to Philadelphia," Victoria said clearly, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "My life is here now, with people who value my contributions and respect my choices." Blackwood's expression darkened with the petulant anger of someone unaccustomed to direct defiance. "Victoria, you're being unreasonable. We have legal commitments, family expectations, business arrangements that depend on our marriage proceeding as planned." "I never agreed to be part of your business arrangements," Victoria replied. "Our engagement was my father's decision, not mine." One of Blackwood's companions, a heavy-set man with scarred knuckles, moved closer to the conversation with obvious intimidation intent. Jasper responded by stepping beside Victoria, his father's rifle held ready, but not directly threatening. "The lady has made her position clear," Jasper said quietly. "Seems like there's nothing left to discuss." Blackwood studied Jasper with the dismissive appraisal typically reserved for hired servants or inferior social classes. "And you are?" "Jasper Hartwell. I helped build this school. How charming." Victoria always did have romantic notions about common laborers and their simple virtues. Blackwood's tone carried calculated insult designed to provoke emotional response. "But surely you understand that a woman of Victoria's breeding and education belongs in more sophisticated society." The crowd stirred with resentment at Blackwood's condescension, recognizing the implied criticism of their community and their teacher's choice to live among them. Morrison stepped forward with unusual gravity. "Mister, I don't know what kind of society you come from, but around here we judge folks by their character and contributions, not their bank accounts or fancy bloodlines." Blackwood ignored Morrison entirely, his attention focused on Victoria with intensifying determination. My dear, I've been patient with this childish rebellion, but my patience has limits. You will return to Philadelphia with me today to fulfill your obligations, and if I refuse—" Blackwood gestured toward the nearly completed schoolhouse with theatrical regret. "Then I'm afraid this charming little building will face some very serious legal challenges. Territorial education authorities take compliance violations quite seriously, especially when significant safety concerns are brought to their attention." The threat was exactly what Jasper had expected: official interference disguised as legitimate regulatory enforcement. Men like Blackwood rarely used direct violence when legal manipulation could achieve the same goals with less personal risk. "What kind of safety concerns?" Dr. Matthews asked, his medical training making him particularly sensitive to student welfare issues. One of Blackwood's companions withdrew a folder from his saddlebags, containing what appeared to be official documents with territorial government seals. Structural inadequacies, improper ventilation, fire safety violations, teacher certification irregularities. Standard regulatory review. Jasper recognized the papers as either forgeries or documents obtained through corruption rather than legitimate inspection. The schoolhouse exceeded all territorial requirements, and Victoria's teaching credentials were impeccable. But disproving false accusations would require time and legal resources that Cedar Ridge couldn't easily provide. "Those are fabricated charges," Victoria said firmly. "This building meets every territorial standard, and my certification is completely valid." Blackwood smiled with practiced charm that didn't reach his calculating eyes. "Of course, my dear, but regulatory investigations can take months or years to resolve, during which time the school would remain closed. Pending final determination, the strategy was elegantly vicious, using bureaucratic delays to destroy the community's educational investment while forcing Victoria to choose between her personal freedom and her students' welfare. Even if the charges were eventually dismissed, the school year would be lost, and the building might suffer damage from extended closure. "There's another option," Blackwood continued. "Return to Philadelphia with me, and I'll ensure that all regulatory concerns are withdrawn. The school can open on schedule, the children can receive their education, and everyone benefits from reasonable compromise." Victoria's hands clenched into fists, anger overriding her careful self-control. "You mean everyone benefits from my—" "Surrender to your manipulative demands. I mean everyone benefits from practical recognition that some battles can't be won by stubborn idealism." The assembled townspeople stirred with growing resentment at Blackwood's arrogant assumptions about their community's capabilities. These were people who'd built a railroad town from prairie grass, who'd survived harsh winters and economic uncertainties through collective determination. Franklin stepped forward with the careful precision of someone who understood legal procedures. "Mr. Blackwood, if you have legitimate regulatory concerns about our school, you're welcome to file them through proper channels. We'll address any valid issues through established territorial processes." Blackwood's companion consulted his pocket watch with theatrical timing. "Actually, the territorial inspector should be arriving within the hour. He'll need to conduct a complete examination of the building and review all construction records." The announcement caught Cedar Ridge's defenders off guard, revealing the extent of Blackwood's preparation for this confrontation. He'd arranged official inspection as leverage, knowing that any delays or complications would strengthen his position. Jasper felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came with recognizing superior force applied through superior resources. Blackwood had money, connections, and legal authority that could overwhelm community resistance despite Cedar Ridge's moral advantages. "Victoria," Blackwood said, moving closer with renewed confidence, "I'm offering you one final opportunity to resolve this situation reasonably. Come with me now, and I'll protect this community from the consequences of their misguided loyalty to you." Victoria looked around the crowd of faces that had become dear to her during months of shared labor and mutual respect. Children peered from behind their parents, understanding that something important was happening, even if they couldn't follow the adult complexities involved. "These people have done nothing wrong," she said quietly. "They don't deserve to suffer for my choices." Blackwood sensed victory in her wavering resolve. "Then make the choice that protects them. Show the same consideration for their welfare that they've shown for yours." As Victoria struggled with the impossible decision between personal freedom and community welfare, Jasper made his own choice about what mattered most and what risks were worth taking for the people and dreams he'd learned to love. Before Victoria could respond to Blackwood's ultimatum, the sound of horses approaching from the west announced new arrivals. A territorial marshal rode into view accompanied by an official inspector, their timing suggesting coordination with Blackwood's plan to pressure the community through regulatory intimidation. But as the officials drew closer, Jasper noticed something unexpected in their demeanor. Marshal Wade Thompson, a man he'd met during previous territorial business, wore an expression of grim determination rather than bureaucratic compliance. The inspector beside him carried himself with the alert posture of someone prepared for confrontation rather than routine examination. "Mr. Blackwood," Marshal Thompson called as he dismounted, his voice carrying official authority that commanded immediate attention. "I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of mail fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to defraud territorial education funds." The announcement struck the assembled crowd like lightning, transforming the confrontation's entire dynamic in a matter of seconds. Blackwood's confident composure cracked, revealing genuine surprise and growing alarm. "Marshal, there must be some mistake," Blackwood said, backing away from Thompson's advancing figure. "I'm here on private family business regarding my fiancé's return to Philadelphia." Thompson consulted an official document while keeping his hand near his weapon. "According to territorial investigators, you've been using fraudulent regulatory complaints to extort money from frontier communities, then withdrawing the complaints in exchange for payment to fictitious educational improvement funds." The inspector, introducing himself as Samuel Morrison from the Territorial Education Department, addressed the crowd with information that explained Blackwood's elaborate scheme. "We've been tracking a pattern of false safety violations and teacher certification challenges, targeting successful school projects across 3 territories. The complaints always come from the same source, a Philadelphia investment group with connections to regulatory officials." Victoria stepped forward, her teaching training making her naturally inquisitive about official procedures. "Are you saying that Preston has been systematically attacking frontier schools?" "Yes, ma'am," Inspector Morrison replied. "His method involves identifying successful educational projects, filing false regulatory complaints to create crisis situations, then offering to resolve the problems in exchange for substantial payments or other considerations." Jasper felt pieces of a larger puzzle falling into place, understanding that Victoria's situation was part of a broader pattern of exploitation targeting vulnerable communities. Blackwood had used his wealth and connections to prey on frontier hopes and dreams. The school bell that arrived yesterday morning contained more than just bronze and iron, Marshal Thompson continued, gesturing toward the beautiful bell that community donations had purchased for their completed schoolhouse. It also contained documentation proving Mr. Blackwood's involvement in fraudulent schemes affecting dozens of Western communities. The bell, suspended from its wooden frame near the schoolhouse entrance, gleamed in the morning sunlight like a symbol of educational hope realized despite external threats. Its clear, resonant tone had rung across Cedar Ridge the previous evening, announcing the school's completion and the community's triumph over adversity. "How did you obtain this evidence?" Victoria asked, her legal questions reflecting both curiosity and hope that justice might actually prevail over wealth and influence. Inspector Morrison smiled with satisfaction of someone who'd successfully concluded a difficult investigation. An anonymous benefactor provided extensive documentation about Mr. Blackwood's activities, including correspondence with corrupt officials and financial records showing fraudulent fund transfers. Blackwood's three companions had gradually moved away from their employer, recognizing that association with a wanted criminal offered no advantages and considerable risks. Their professional survival instincts overcame whatever loyalty money had purchased. "This is preposterous," Blackwood protested, though his voice lacked its previous confidence. "I demand to speak with my attorney before answering any accusations." "You'll have that opportunity," Marshal Thompson replied, producing handcuffs with practiced efficiency, "after we transport you to the territorial capital for formal arraignment." As Thompson placed Blackwood under arrest, Victoria moved to Jasper's side, seeking support from the partnership that had sustained her through months of challenge and growth. Her face showed relief, mixed with lingering disbelief that their ordeal might actually be ending. "Who do you think provided the evidence?" she asked quietly. Jasper had his suspicions, based on conversations with Eastern investors who'd shown genuine interest in educational improvement rather than fraudulent exploitation. "Someone who believed your school project was worth protecting from corrupt interference." The crowd began dispersing as the immediate crisis resolved into routine legal procedures, but several community members lingered to examine their completed schoolhouse with renewed appreciation. The building represented more than educational facilities. It had become a symbol of what frontier communities could accomplish. When they refused to surrender to outside pressure, Dr. Matthews approached Victoria with the relieved smile of someone who'd witnessed justice prevailing over injustice. "Miss Summers, I believe your teaching position is secure for as long as you want it." Victoria's response was interrupted by the territorial inspector's request to examine the schoolhouse interior. Though his purpose was now celebration rather than criticism, the building exceeded all regulatory requirements, demonstrating what thoughtful planning and community commitment could achieve. As they toured the completed classroom, with its carefully positioned windows, efficient heating system, and spacious learning environment, Inspector Morrison offered observations that validated Victoria's educational philosophy. "This is exactly the kind of facility that territorial authorities want to encourage. Local initiative producing exceptional results." The school bell rang again as wind caught its bronze surface, the clear tone carrying across Cedar Ridge like a promise of educational excellence for current and future generations. Children gathered beneath the bell's frame, their excited chatter suggesting eager anticipation for formal classes to begin. "Mr. Hartwell," Victoria said as they stood in the doorway of their completed schoolhouse, "I can't adequately express my gratitude for everything you've done to make this dream reality." Jasper removed his father's silver pocket watch, opening it to check the time, while considering how much had changed since Victoria first knocked on his cabin door with her ambitious proposal. The watch still carried Sarah's inscription, but the words now felt like blessing rather than burden. "Victoria," he said, using her given name naturally for the first time in public, "I was wondering if you might consider a more permanent partnership than just school construction." Her smile was radiant with understanding and acceptance, confirming what their months of collaboration had gradually revealed about compatibility, mutual respect, and the possibility of love discovered through shared commitment to worthy goals. "I was hoping you might ask," she replied, touching the cameo at her throat that connected her to family history, while embracing the future they could build together. As Marshal Thompson prepared to escort his prisoner toward territorial justice, Preston Blackwood made one final attempt to manipulate the situation through personal appeal. "Victoria, surely you won't abandon everything we planned together for this provincial existence." Victoria's response carried the quiet dignity that had sustained her through months of challenge and growth. "Preston, I never planned anything with you. My father and yours made plans, but I chose my own path the moment I left Philadelphia." The rejection was final, delivered without anger or vindictiveness, simply the honest statement of someone who discovered her true calling among people who valued her contributions rather than her social connections. After the officials departed with their prisoner, Cedar Ridge began preparing for the celebration that would mark both the school's completion and their teachers' permanent commitment to the community. The building that had started as Victoria's ambitious dream had become everyone's shared achievement. As evening approached, Jasper and Victoria stood together in the schoolhouse they'd built through partnership, determination, and the support of neighbors who'd chosen courage over capitulation. The simple gold wedding band Jasper had crafted during quiet moments of construction work waited in his pocket, ready to symbolize their commitment to building a future as solid and lasting as the limestone walls surrounding them. The wedding took place 6 weeks later in the schoolhouse they'd built together, with the entire community of Cedar Ridge gathered to witness the union of their teacher and the carpenter who'd helped make her dreams reality. Victoria wore her mother's cameo and a simple white dress that complemented rather than competed with the building's limestone elegance, while Jasper stood beside her in his best suit, his father's silver pocket watch gleaming in the winter sunlight that streamed through the carefully positioned windows. Reverend McKinnon performed the ceremony with words that emphasized partnership, mutual respect, and the kind of love that grows stronger through shared challenges and common purpose. When Jasper placed the simple gold wedding band he'd crafted on Victoria's finger, it seemed to complete something that had begun the night she knocked on his cabin door with her ambitious proposal. "This ring represents more than our marriage," Jasper said during the exchange of vows, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the schoolhouse they'd built together. "It represents our commitment to building things that last, to creating beauty that serves purpose, and to choosing hope over fear in everything we do." Victoria's response reflected the same thoughtful consideration she'd brought to every aspect of their partnership. "Jasper, you taught me that the strongest foundations aren't made of stone and mortar, but of trust, respect, and the willingness to work together toward shared dreams. I promise to honor that lesson for the rest of our lives." After the ceremony, the community celebrated with a feast that Mrs. Henderson had coordinated with her characteristic efficiency, transforming the schoolhouse into a reception hall filled with laughter, music, and the satisfied conversation of people who'd witnessed something important and lasting take shape in their midst. Henry Morrison offered a toast that captured the feelings of everyone present. To Victoria and Jasper, who showed us that when good people work together for worthy causes, they can accomplish things that seemed impossible just a few months ago. Dr. Matthews added his own observation about the broader significance of their achievement. "This schoolhouse represents more than one building in one town. It proves that frontier communities can create institutions equal to anything found in established eastern cities. Maybe better, because they're built with local investment and genuine community commitment." As the celebration continued into the evening, children played games around the schoolhouse yard, while adults shared stories about the construction project and speculated about Cedar Ridge's continued growth. The building had become a symbol of what their community could accomplish when it combined individual skills with collective determination. Victoria and Jasper slipped away from the festivities to walk through the town that had become their shared home, noting changes that had occurred since their project began. New businesses had opened, additional families had settled in the area, and plans were underway for a library that would complement their educational facilities. "Do you ever regret leaving Philadelphia?" Jasper asked, as they paused outside Morrison's general store, where lamplight revealed shelves stocked with goods from across the country. Victoria considered the question seriously, her hand touching the cameo that connected her to family history while embracing the life she'd chosen for herself. "I regret the pain my departure caused my father, but I don't regret the choice itself. This is where I belong, with people who value what I can contribute rather than what I represent socially." They walked past the bank, where Franklin had supported their construction financing, beyond the church, where many of their volunteers gathered each Sunday, toward the schoolhouse that gleamed white in the moonlight, like a promise fulfilled through patient effort and mutual support. "What do you think Sarah would have thought about all this?" Victoria asked, referring to Jasper's first wife with the gentle curiosity of someone secure enough in her own relationship to honor his previous love. Jasper pulled his father's pocket watch from his vest, opening it to reveal the inscription that had sustained him through 15 years of solitude. She would have loved seeing children learn in a building designed specifically for their education. She always believed that investing in young minds was the best way to build a better future. Victoria nodded with understanding, recognizing how Sarah's memory had enriched rather than diminished their own relationship. Then we'll make sure this school honors her belief as well as our own hopes. They entered the schoolhouse through the main door they'd hung together, walking between rows of desks that would soon be filled with students, eager to learn reading, arithmetic, and the broader lessons about possibility that came from being educated in a beautiful space created through community effort. The school bell, suspended in its wooden frame near the entrance, caught the moonlight with the same gleam that had announced their building's completion and the community's triumph over external threats. Its bronze surface bore an inscription that Victoria had commissioned from the territorial metalworker. Cedar Ridge Community School, built by people who believed in tomorrow. 32 students are enrolled for the spring term, Victoria reported, consulting the registration records she'd been maintaining throughout the winter months, including some older children whose parents finally decided formal education might be worth the investment. Jasper examined the classroom arrangement they'd refined during the past weeks, noting how Victoria had organized learning spaces to accommodate multiple age groups while maintaining efficient supervision. Her Eastern training in educational methodology had been adapted to frontier realities with creativity and practical wisdom. Mrs. Henderson wants to donate funds for a piano, Victoria continued. She believes music education should be part of any complete curriculum. The prospect of piano music filling their limestone schoolhouse appealed to Jasper's appreciation for beauty that served practical purpose. Where would we put it? Victoria pointed to the alcove they'd designed for library materials, where natural acoustics would carry musical instruction throughout the building. It would fit perfectly there, with room for small performances when parents visit to observe their children's progress. As they prepared to leave their completed schoolhouse for the privacy of the cabin they now shared, Victoria paused to straighten desks and arrange teaching materials with the automatic efficiency of someone who'd found her true calling. The simple gold wedding band on her finger caught the lamplight, symbolizing partnership rather than possession. "Jasper," she said, turning to face him with the direct gaze that had impressed him from their first meeting. "I want you to know that building this school with you has been the greatest privilege of my life. Not just the construction, but everything it represents about what people can accomplish when they choose cooperation over competition." Jasper felt the same satisfaction, understanding that their schoolhouse had become more than an educational facility. It was proof that individual skills combined with community support could create institutions worthy of the children they served and the dreams they nurtured. "Mine, too," he replied, meaning every word. "Tomorrow we'll start, teaching the next generation that ambitious dreams backed by hard work and community support can become beautiful realities." They extinguished the schoolhouse lamps and walked together through the streets of Cedar Ridge, past businesses and homes that had supported their vision, toward the cabin that Jasper had enlarged to accommodate married life, with a woman who brought books, laughter, and hope for the future into spaces that had known only solitude for too many years. The stars above promised clear weather for tomorrow's first official day of classes in the Cedar Ridge Community School, where children would learn not just reading and arithmetic, but also the larger lesson that some dreams are too important to abandon, no matter what obstacles arise to challenge their realization. Behind them, the schoolhouse stood solid and permanent against the prairie horizon, its limestone walls and carefully crafted details testifying to the power of partnership between people who'd discovered that building something beautiful together. was even more satisfying than dreaming about it. Alone, some acts of kindness truly do ripple through lives in ways no one can predict, creating possibilities that seemed impossible until they become as permanent as stone foundations and as enduring as the love that makes such achievements worthwhile.